Thank you for joining us. My name is Emma Weinlich and I'm one of the directors at Voyage Support. For those who may not be familiar with us, Voyage is a boutique provider of specialist support coordination, psychosocial recovery coaching and positive behaviour support, supporting participants with complex needs across Australia. We're a registered provider with NDIS and also SSR to deliver MACNI, which is Multiple and Complex Needs Initiative run through DFFH. We're really pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, NDIS Funding and Practice, 24/7 Supports, 2-to-1 Ratios and Complex Needs. We're also particularly excited, as you know, this is our first webinar and we hope that it will be the first of many opportunities to share insights and contribute to conversations across the sector. Joining us today are David Callinan and Tam Tyson, both Specialist Support Coordinators at Voyage Support. Prior to joining Voyage, David and Tam held a range of planning, leadership and complex support needs roles within the agency, providing them with a unique perspective on both participant support and complex funding discussions. Also joining us today is Steph Rietkirk, our Program Lead for Specialist Support Coordination, who will be supporting the Q&A discussion later in the session. Before we begin, I'd like to note that today's discussion is based on professional experience, observations and reflections from practice. While David and Tam have previous experience within the NDIA, they are presenting today in their capacity as specialist support coordinators. Their information shared should be considered general information only and should not be interpreted as advice on behalf of the NDIA. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be made available following the session. Questions are welcome throughout the webinar via the Q&A function. Steph will be monitoring questions as they come through and we'll do our best to address as many as possible towards the end of the webinar. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land from which I am joining. What you told us. So when people registered for today's webinar, we asked what they were hoping to learn. We've received a wide range of responses from multiple people across the disability sector, including sport coordination, BSPs, allied health, and other professionals. While the responses varied, some clear themes emerged and many people were looking for a better understanding of evidence considerations for 24/7 supports and 2-to-1 ratios, insight into funding discussions relating to complex support needs and practical examples of what has helped strengthen support requests in practice. There was a strong interest in understanding how to balance safety, risk, participant outcomes and capacity building when supporting people with complex needs. We've used that feedback to help shape today's discussion and ensure the content is as practical and relevant as possible. With that, I'll hand over to David.
Thanks, Emma. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Emma said, this is our first webinar as a team, and it's as exciting as it is nerve-wracking. So appreciate you all being here. Hopefully we'll make this worthwhile for you. I'm going to talk particularly about evidence and data capture. I think it's fairly clear, I think you've all experienced that we're living in a fairly unprecedented evidentiary era now, where the days of demonstrating an impairment was sufficient. It's no longer the case. Now we need to actually demonstrate the severity of it and drill down into the minutiae of how it impacts the participant and the risks associated with the impairments. It's no longer enough to show that some alternative options have been explored and clinical recommendations are that the NDIS should step in and provide the support. We now need to demonstrate all alternatives have been explored and failed and why they failed. And this may put a participant at risk for a period of time, but bear in mind that if you don't meet these evidence levels, then you're going to be thrown into lengthy review processes and the risks are still going to be apparent. So it's really good to kind of front load this. What you're really looking to do right now is actually to remove any angles or loopholes the NDIS can take to decline. Now that they're fully operating as an insurance model, they are looking first and foremost to decline any support that you request. And This could come down to even the provision of informal supports and why informal supports can't be engaged. And I've seen situations where the agency is expecting neighbours, friends, family, quite strange connections to be included as informal supports, and making assumptions that that participants have a level of informal support that they don't. You'll need to provide that evidence, whether it's burnout, whether it's employment ramifications, and you can have statements from informal supports declaring why they're not available. But it is worth applying some common sense to it. So you don't always have to submit that level of evidence, but you are really looking to close any angles or loopholes the NDIS may look to decline. One of the best things to do, and as we are talking today about complex supports, so primarily this is 24/7 supports, high intensity supports above 8 hours a day, 2-to-1 supports, intensive care at home, high level nursing. One of the most important things you need to do now is actually capturing the daily data. So I'd suggest most of you are familiar with allied health practitioners having things like QR codes or web forms. And these forms capture things like behavioural patterns, incidents, and sleep. And we still need that, but you can also use those web forms and those links to QR codes to capture just daily minutiae, to demonstrate what a day in the life of a particular support worker or a parent, more importantly, is. So the NDIS has now taken the position for minors that parental supports, the standard of parental support has been raised significantly. So now we need to demonstrate that there is a severe need that goes significantly beyond what would normally be expected of a parent. And it's very hard to capture that. So we've got carer impact statements, and that's obviously a great way to provide an insight into the impact that the support needs are having on a parent for burnout. But it doesn't have as much weight as it used to carry. It used to be a situation where the planner would sort of humanely and compassionately understand that looking at the evidence suggests that this particular child can come with some severe burnout risk and anticipate that. But now you've actually got to demonstrate that it's already in play. One of the best ways of doing that is to just get them to fill in or diarise each day and demonstrate why every day there is a significant need for support above what would be expected of a parent of a child that doesn't have that diagnosis. For adults, it's necessary to capture a minimum of 3 months. So if you've got an adult participant and you're looking for complex support needs or care, 24/7 supports, 2-to-1 supports, it is necessary to capture a minimum of 3 months sleep data and incident reports, and also the daily support data, particularly if you've got 2-to-1 supports that you're requesting. The data really needs to capture what that second support worker is doing every minute. Otherwise, it's unlikely that you'll get that funding across the line. Obviously, reporting is still a very significant aspect of the evidence. It used to be that a strong and robust OT, functional capacity assessment, or SIL assessment would do the job. But it is our job as support coordinators now to really go through those reports and make sure the language is strong, and that the reports differentiate between capacity building supports and general support. So if you've got core funding for general support, then that's just assistance with your activities of daily living, where the participant can't manage that themselves. No matter how much therapy we throw at them, they're always going to have these impairments, these deficits that are above and beyond what anybody without that diagnosis would face. But there are plenty of participants, particularly in that sort of late teens, early 20s group, where baseline may not have been set and there is still capacity building available or possible. And it is really important that the reports differentiate between participants that do have the ability to increase their baseline and those that don't. And therefore, you're asking for these high-level complex supports, and they're going to be ongoing. Quite often, particularly with the younger participants, the agency is expecting that the reports show, and also the fund usage shows, that the capacity building funds have been used and maximised to demonstrate that this person has been given as much capacity building support as possible. They've reached their baseline, and now we are going to need to provide the support term. And I've personally experienced examples where a participant has required 24/7 supports and they've been given a very low amount of support, in this case 1 hour a day. And the consistent argument from the internal review team, we went as high as assistant directors and directors, all saying the same thing, that there is capacity building supports that have not been utilised sufficiently to demonstrate that he's met his baseline, and they kept refusing the supports. Now, he'd just come from living living at home and being removed from 24/7 care of a foster family. And he had no independent living experience before, and the agency was happy with providing 1 hour of support. It seems ridiculous, but the arguments were that we needed to demonstrate that, yes, maybe we can increase his capacity, but for now we need to stabilise him, and then he does need 24/7 supports. And he was put at great risk for a number of months, living alone, and it's quite miraculous that he didn't come to any catastrophe. We've achieved what we wanted to achieve now, but it took developing really robust evidence that demonstrated exactly why he needed the support, and also why we couldn't increase his baseline for him to potentially have shared supports. So the other thing about reports that's very, very important is that they don't equivocate or leave room for misinterpretation. And you kind of need to assume that the person who's reading the report is an idiot, because there are experiences that I've had, and I've spoken to others, where there's been interpretations of evidence that it just doesn't make any sense. And the average rational person would never go to that conclusion. But the best way to avoid that is to spell it out to a point where there's no way for them to interpret it any other way. And a recent example for mine would be that a participant of mine who has DID, for those who aren't aware of that term, it's dissociative identity disorder, so multiple personality disorder. She has 350 plus personalities, and they pop out at any given moment, usually every 5 minutes or so. And the only delineation is sort of a short period of catatonia. And the agency has never given her the opportunity to sit in front of a planner or anybody from the outside. Nobody's actually seen it. So all they're getting is reading off the reports, the descriptions of the appearance of the alters and how they present and the risks they present to the participant. And we recently had a situation where the agency or whoever was reading the reports thought that the alters, who each have their own names and identities, as referenced, were other participants, and so that the participant was able to use shared supports, not realising that each of these other people were actually personalities within her own mind. So you've just got to assume that you're going to go into situations where the evidence, as reasonable and clinical as it might sound to you and to everybody else, then our role is to really go through it and make sure that the language is incredibly robust, never using terms like would benefit from, always using terms like must, and remove any doubt that can be applied or interpreted by a planner to not fund. Moving on to planning meetings. It used to be we'd go into a planning meeting, and as a planner myself, I'd go into a planning meeting expecting there to be some level of negotiation and investigation. You'd go in and you'd meet the participant and their care team. You'd talk about what's been going on, what their support needs are, and you'd learn a little bit more about them than what was actually in the reports. And you take that information away and you would build a report, you build a plan from that. No longer the case. It's now a dictation. They come into the meetings, I'm sure you've all experienced this, where the plan has already been determined, and that there's no negotiation or discussion or further investigation happening in that planning meeting. So it's important that we prepare participants for difficult experiences, for triggering experiences, and for being told that some of their support needs are not realistic, or that it's not the agency's role to fund that. And the best thing you can do is just take notes of the planner's approach. I'm quite often hearing planners talking about how they've got to approve it today, or it's got to be approved this week, or it's got to be kept below a certain level, value-wise. that's a planner who has KPIs and who is telling you that that's more important than a good outcome for the participant. And that is grounds for an official complaint, which you do through the NDIS website, as opposed to getting a bad outcome. That's misconduct. But it's becoming quite common. And when you're getting bad outcomes, you're going to feel like the planner hasn't considered all of the evidence, and that is quite common and often the truth, particularly if you're submitting large swathes of documents. I recently had an experience where we submitted 174 pages worth of evidence, and then were told by the planner that certain things weren't evidenced, and it was just patently untrue. I'd written a document where I had I'd written the plan as we wanted it, and actually noted what document and what page on what document the evidence could be found, and the planner didn't read that and then tried to claim that some evidence was not available. So you're going to get, no matter how much evidence you submit, you're going to get experiences where the planner's claiming that the evidence isn't there, and that's what you're going to need to go to your reviews. And when your reviews options are obviously the Section 100, the reviewable decision, the internal review, or the ART, depending on which application's been declined. When you're submitting the Section 100 report, obviously you're going to need more evidence, and it's feasible to submit a statement to claim with examples why the planner didn't consider all the evidence that was initially submitted, as a way to resubmit your already submitted evidence as new evidence. It's also a good idea to kind of escalate that process, because at the moment you're looking at about 90 days to get a Section 100 response and about a 13% success rate. Most people are being forced into the ART pathway, which is really difficult and lengthy. It's always good to let them know that somebody's watching, and the way you can do that is to submit what's known as a MASCO. And a MASCO is a member and stakeholder coordination officer, and they receive complaints or representations from local federal MPs, senators, and participants. And the point of the MASCO is to have the agency revisit their processes, and potentially provide sort of it kind of bumps you up the queue, or it gets eyes on your application essentially. And they're very responsive to that, and it's quite a good way to provide support to your review request. And so that's something that you send to your federal MP, and it is in these requests you outline the funding issues and the associated risks with the participant is going to face without the funding, and it should focus on that, not about the planner's attitude or behaviour, but just about the risks, and the MP or whoever receives your request will represent that to the agency, and a MASCO, so the liaison officer within the MASCO office, will then take that up, and they'll reach out and talk to you about what your available solutions are. This is outside the complaints process, so it's a separate pathway, and it's usually designed to use to address immediate and significant risk. So that's my information for today. Obviously, after this, we'll be taking Q&As. If anything's come up that you've got any queries on, I'm happy to address, but I'm going to hand it over to Tam.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Very informative, and appreciate the very detailed information provided. And look, some of that information you've done as well today is a really good segue into the 24/7 supports and 2-to-1 ratios in practice. We have a whole range of different considerations that we really want to be able to focus on, but support should always be presented for person-centred supports. It's evidence-based and it's regularly reviewed. High-level supports like 2-to-1 must always be clearly justified, and typically we need to see those multiple areas of evidence and engagement with professionals, and where necessary, that multidisciplinary involvement. There's been some touch on today in regards to MACNI that we have involved with, but also things like child protection. You might have justice overlays, mainstream health supports, participants leaving hospital, for example, for the first time after acquiring a disability, TAC interventions as well. Where we look at the evidence that we are wanting to really ensure that as support coordinators we're gathering, the effective supports that we're wanting to get for our participants is that the person's rights and their preferences, what matters to them, always first and foremost. And the best research evidence that we can demonstrate to show what's been proven to work for that participant, but also what's been proven to work in similar circumstances that the participant might now be in, and might be only now as a newly acquired disability, still understanding what their baseline will be. Clinical and provider expertise, so using those skills and those professional judgments with your allied health teams, and the real world environment. So what's practical and what's safe day to day. So in practice, as support coordinators, that really is about us advocating to an extent, but also not taking on the role as an advocate in supporting the choice, communication and independence for our clients, using those evidence-based strategies. So not the outdated or fad approaches. We can find that there will be circumstances where there might be aromatherapy mentioned, for example, as that evidence-based for sensory, not necessarily. Might it work for that participant? Yes, but it's not necessarily looked at as a clinically diagnosed or evidence-based approach for remedying capacity building or for engagement. Collecting and reviewing real data, so incidents, progress reports and feedback, and then applying professional skills and adapting to real environments as well. We do find that for 2-to-1 supports and in 24/7, there can be some misconceptions. So what that's looking at is that sometimes more complexity, it doesn't always automatically justify higher level staffing, whether that be on a 24/7 model or increased ratios of support. Higher ratios aren't always going to be permanent and they do need to be reviewed. There have been times throughout the NDIA where 2-to-1 support would be considered restrictive or also could be considered triggering for a participant. So we really need to ensure that those 2-to-1 support requests are evidence-based. And it's not always that more staff warrant for better outcomes. There will be situations where participants actually do not want people around them. Their behaviours are to escape, and those escalation points are because 2 people are there. So that's where we really need to focus on the functional capacity of our participants, the risks and the evidence, and that 2-to-1's only one strategy. It's not always going to be the best way to manage risk. And when we come to those day-to-day supports, having support workers who are suitably qualified and trained to understand the training that they're getting from, for example, BSP providers in reflective practice, to implement those strategies, document the successes and the barriers with really cohesive, very detailed shift notes, review outcomes, and also providing feedback to demonstrate the need for supports. In my previous role before working with Voyage, I was an area manager for some time in a SIL provider, and the best cases that I was able to put forward for additional support to their care teams was when my workers for the disabilities at the direct support were able to really clearly identify what it is that they were doing with the participant. And I would look at, why does one shift never have any incident reports? Why are there never any escalations with this particular worker? How can we implement that to be able to come into other shifts and best support the participant? So David did touch on levels of evidence that are required. When it's coming to that 2-to-1 and that 24/7, it does need to be safe and effective and respect the person's rights and goals, but also showing why the level of support's needed and those alternatives that have been considered as well. So evidence could be from the person, could be research-based, practice evidence-based, such as incident reports, behaviour data, professional expertise, so your occupational therapists, physiotherapists, your behaviour support practitioners. And then the real world context. So what are the environmental risks and barriers and what's practical and safe to implement? In one environment, in a contained environment, such as a home, there might be ways to implement certain strategies that aren't able to be replicated in the community. So what is it in the community environment that do we need to demonstrate where those differences happen and those risks might be presented as well? Something that we also need to be mindful of is the time limited versus ongoing supports. So when we're talking about time limited supports, that could be aiming to build those skills like David mentioned before about getting to that baseline and reducing risk and creating a meaningful change within a set time frame or within a time frame that we're trying to measure outcomes with through implemented strategies and ongoing supports. They're the ones that are going to be needed long term due to the permanent disability impacts. And then justifying that. So why the person's needs permanent, what risks can't be safely reduced or responded to, data showing the ongoing incidents or the failed reduction of support. So sometimes to evidence need, as Dave mentioned before, we need to see that things have almost failed for NDIA to understand that the support needs are in place for good reason, and without them, they're going to have ongoing risk for the participant. And also that it's the least restrictive safe option. Restrictive practice is something which all of us, I'm sure, have come across in some regard, but the reduction of risk and applying the least restrictive safe option is always going to be something that will benefit. So supports in real life, as we mentioned before, the rise in perspectives of the person, real life examples, for example, a behaviour support practitioner who's using evidence-based positive supports strategies rather than outdated or punitive methods. Support workers who are recording incident data, showing when the behaviour occurs, what triggered them, what worked, what didn't. A team reviewing their progress notes to see whether a new strategy is helping reduce distress across different shifts. Providers collecting feedback from the participant about whether a support is working for them or not, and strategies being adjusted after noticing patterns in escalations. So if you're saying that there's 2-to-1 support required, it's also about demonstrating what those risks are. If you're looking at 24/7 support, why is it that not throughout any part of the day can that person be left alone, whether it be through inactive night support or through being around the house? Is there a need for constant repositioning for somebody? Is there somebody that might have ongoing distress and disorientation as a result of stroke or early onset dementia? How is it that we need to adjust those strategies for that 24/7 support? Or is it that we are going to need 24/7 support to be the safest option, but also the least restrictive? The support workers, they do use their judgment, their training, their expertise, but it's also about recognising those early signs of escalation and using de-escalation strategies learnt in training. Clinicians will recommend a structured routine because it aligns with best practice for the person's disability. And providers will also have specialist outcomes that they're trying to seek for their participants as well that are goal orientated. When it is that as a daily support provider, if you feel that it was to be outside of your scope of practice, it really is also understanding where those triage points are to go into mainstream services and supports that might be relevant. You may have a participant who needs a medication review. The NDIA isn't going to fund for that reassessment. That will be a mainstream service. But if your support notes aren't showing that, if the clinician supports and the reports aren't showing that, you're not going to be able to demonstrate that there's a need, and there could be those gaps in services through mainstream that the participant's missing out on, which otherwise could very much assist them. So the other one as well is that the 2-to-1. Some people assume that 2-to-1 or 24/7 support will be ongoing and constant. The reality that is often a time-limited support, and it should be regularly reviewed against the progress for the participant, any risks, and also the capacity building supports that have been implemented and exhausted in order to be able to understand more around the skill development opportunities for the participant, but also for any reduction of risk or behaviour escalations. Higher ratios means better support, not always. Having adequate staff members that are suitably qualified to implement strategies can sometimes be more appropriate as a targeted support. You're really wanting to understand more about the 2-to-1, and we do go through that more in the case study about what that demonstrates in real life examples. But support workers, it's not necessarily that they are there to do everything for the participant. The NDIS is based on capacity building and person-centred practice, meaning that workers should support the skill development but not replace independence where possible. and that the ratios that are determined are based on their functional impairment, risk and safety needs, environmental factors, and evidence of support needs, not just diagnosis. 2-to-1 support isn't the only way to manage risk, but when you're wanting to evidence that to the NDIS, you also need to demonstrate that those behaviour support strategies and those environmental adjustments have been made to be able to show that, well, we're doing X, Y, and Z. The participant is still having these escalations. Behaviour support, having reflective practice for the staff members, and just making sure that everybody is in line with those practice-based evidence examples and those regular check-in points. So that might be the incident reports, behaviour data, outcome measures, feedback and progress notes, and observation that is consistently collected, and that providers are demonstrating that skills for their workers are also adequate. Decisions are informed by the professional judgment, and just making sure that everybody that is on board is also managing their risks, and that if the safety of the participant can't be maintained with less support, what is it that we're doing to build capacity for the participant? How are we demonstrating the least restrictive practice possible? How are risks being managed, and where is that 2-to-1 support needed throughout the day, and what are the reduction strategies as well? So that also comes into the balancing risk, safety and capacity building. It is a huge balance. It is something where we're wanting to ensure that long-term data, repeated incidents, and if there's been a failed attempt to reduce support, what does that look like? What is that risk? What sort of risk category does it fall within? In my previous time at NDIA, I would actually quite often look at the risks that would come out through the Quality and Safeguards Commission, and understand from reverse engineer it. So if there's a risk of this happening, what is the Quality and Safeguards Commission looking for, as well as the NDIA? Quite often there can be that component of regulation and standard that the Quality and Safeguards Commission can give you some hints on as to what sort of presentation you would need to give to the NDIA to demonstrate those risks, what the safety implications are for the participant and also those around them, whether that be in the community or at home, and the capacity building that you're doing to support the participant, but also the capacity building of the people around them. So that's the summary there for you for the 24/7 supports. We do go a little bit more detail into the case discussion and those practical insights. So I'll hand back over to you, David, for your case. Thank you.
Thanks, Tam. That was really informative, and appreciate sort of the real insight there into the complex needs. And it's just, I think that the biggest highlight we need to sort of really focus on is how different things are to what they were maybe a year or two ago, with the level of evidence. I think the biggest case study that I can look at is recently we've had a participant who has been discharged from hospital, and the hospital discharge space is one of the more complex ones, because it used to be the case where hospitals would have a greater rate of success with getting complex supports needs in, because the agency would see that would be a short-term measure, and getting them implemented in the first place was usually the initial goal. But it's now the case where even hospitals are struggling to get that over the line and needing to provide a much higher level of evidence. And so I had a participant who's been in hospital for about a year, and she clearly needed intensive care supports, feeding supports, and she couldn't get out of bed, she couldn't feed herself, she's peg fed, and there are all sorts of behavioural issues as well that made it relatively unsafe to have just one person around, and unsuccessful in often getting a lot of her support needs achieved. And we've managed to discharge her, but it took about 6 months worth of repeated attempts at seeking a high level of funding from the agency, despite the hospital providing in situ reports about what they had to do on a day-to-day basis. And the main reason for that was that the hospital wasn't approaching it on from the basis of what would look like in the community, and they weren't writing evidence to speak to disability support needs. They were writing evidence to speak to health support needs, which obviously the agency doesn't fund. And it took, as I said, it took about 6 months and some significant liaising with the agency, and even the outcome we got was we got something I've never heard of before, which is 2 inactive supports overnight. So then we were looking to find a house where there were 2 spare bedrooms, which doesn't exist in this industry. We managed to find a bit of a unicorn scenario where we've got her moved into a house with her sister, who's also an NDIS participant. But we had an even more bizarre scenario where both girls have got inactive sleepover overnight. So 2 participants in one house with 3 sleeping support workers. So they're the kind of outcomes that you can kind of expect. The benefit of that is that we are able to sort of use the plans amorphously. And so we have been able to create a situation with the SIL provider where the support needs are met within the confines of the budget. But the feedback from the agency was that the hospital did not provide sufficient evidence to demonstrate that active overnights were required, despite the fact that every 2 hours the participant needed to be fed, because she only feeds while she's asleep through her PEG system. So that kind of demonstrates the level of support that, you know, the level of evidence that we really do need within a really complex scenario. And as a case study, it really does kind of demonstrate where the agency is now sort of positioning itself as far as the obligations of other systems, whether it's mainstream health, whether it's community, whether it's informal. I think that the most significant supports and the things that helped us actually get through the barriers was time. And we were a little bit fortunate here that the participant was in hospital, so she was the risk was mitigated by having that emergent support around her. But that also meant that it was a little bit more difficult for us to try to extrapolate how that would look in the community or in supported housing. And so we needed to work with, because in a hospital situation, you can't have community supports providing therapy. So we couldn't have our own supports come in to provide that context or write reports. So a lot of it actually involved us working directly with the participant and getting their voice heard. And that can be quite powerful too, to have their voice heard in the documents and to be seen, in this case, by the planner to the level of complexity that was required. And for us, at the end of it, it was learned just not to take things for granted, that it was no longer a situation where we assume that, you know, you've got a young person who is in hospital, who wants to get out of hospital, who needs critical support care that is usually only found in a hospital or an aged care home, and that the agency will then see that as their responsibility to fund. We really had to demonstrate, as Tam and I both spoken about, you've really got to show that you've tried everything and that you've failed. And we also had a situation with this participant where the discharge had failed a few months earlier because the supports around her were not sufficient. So we had that as a backup as well. But it just goes to speak to the kind of failures and the risks that participants are being put through to get the right funding and what to expect.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. And similarly for the supports that you explained before about the hospital discharge, it can be really difficult, particularly when you've got those participants that are a newly acquired disability. Quite often the hospital discharge, those first plans that you have, it's almost about trying to get all the evidence and all the reports and all the examples that you possibly can post-discharge to demonstrate the ongoing disability support needs. So it can be quite difficult. My case study is a little bit different, and I've swapped out names and all those sorts of things. So this might sound familiar, but it's not, because it's made up. But it's from real life examples that we can all understand as well. So I have had a participant, however, that they had very individual and complex behavioural and functional support needs. They were receiving 2-to-1 supports, meaning that they had two people with them at all times. And this part of it absolutely is something that's a lived experience in my previous roles, but they really need to have the effective implementation of their behaviour support plan in order for effective engagement with the people in the home, but also the community, and around school as well. They were still completing their schooling. So there was also disability supports needed from the school approach. It was a specialist school, and child protection involvement, and Department of Families, Fairness and Housing were also involved. Their behaviours of concern included physical aggression, property damage, and high impulsivity and unsafe behaviours. Those behaviours could happen without warning and could escalate rapidly. I had this particular participant who actively assaulted 2 grown men, and ended up both of them in hospital. And although those 2 staff were actively implementing the behaviour support plan and swap out strategies, there was still a lot of very unpredictable behaviours that were being demonstrated. We would have one support worker who would engage and support with the participant directly. For the sake of this case, I will call them Josh, and allow for the second worker to manage those environmental safety factors, remove triggers, or call for assistance if necessary, and also to reduce the risk of injury to Josh, staff, and members of the public. So a single staff member couldn't safely manage both the engagement and the environmental safety during, before, or after escalation. When there were times of calm, yes, it was possible for one person to be present, but that second person would always be within line of sight or within hearing distance within the home, because you want to be able to build capacity and you want to be able to give space. The idea of, and this was an older teenager, just sitting there doing something, you've got 2 people hovering over you, doesn't feel good. So that would sometimes kick off behaviours. But in the same instance, if we're trying to build capacity for them to be able to negotiate, skill development, sharing, complex problem solving, even if it's from start to finish of making a meal, understanding those independent living tasks, that could turn very quickly, particularly when there were utensils involved. Regardless of things for safety, we would always have to have somebody in the background just making sure that things were still okay, even if it was from the office with the door open. They might be writing notes, for example, and detailed shift notes, but still being able to hear what's happening in case there's any triggering behaviours, or those escalation points that sometimes are experienced. So the intensive behaviour support needs, the participant did need continuous verbal prompting, redirection, and immediate response to early warning signs. And the BSP strategy allowed for those 2 simultaneous roles. So one staff member actively engaging with Josh and one staff member monitoring the behaviour and triggers and maintaining safety. And the rationale there is about the effective implementation of the BSP. It's not always possible with one staff member. They needed assistance with daily living, and also engagement and structured support. So they benefited from continuous engagement, predictable routines and structured activities. So 2 staff would allow for one worker to maintain engagement and one worker to monitor wellbeing, manage transitions and adjust the environment to reduce those engagement factors, or increasing the risk of frustration and behaviours of concern. In the community, Josh sometimes would become overwhelmed in the public due to noise, crowds, sensory overload or unexpected changes. And 2 staff are required then to manage Josh through the transition, but also the environmental risks. So for example, out in public, at the shops, making decisions on, dinner had already been made, they had a shopping list, it was about building capacity and going out into the community. And a whole lot of school kids were doing the same thing, primary school kids. That noise absolutely triggered Josh. And then the second staff member was really needing to be there to try to control the environmental risks. So that was also about maintaining safety for Josh and the members of public around. With the evidence for supporting the 2-to-1 support, 2-to-1 staffing, something that really drove into my support workers was about incident reports that demonstrated the start, the middle and the finish, but what strategies they were using from the behaviour support practitioner, so from the behaviour support plan. What was it from the occupational therapist that they've done? How was the day started? Is this a trigger that started in the morning and Josh did not want to go out and you forced him to? Coerced him to go, okay, it's going to be a great idea. He didn't want to go, just leave it. If there's going to be a trigger, why push the boundary? Why create the risk? and just making sure that those high risk behaviours, absconding, for example, and unsafe behaviours were being considered. With the 2-to-1 support, clinical recommendations are always really important. So those functional behaviour assessment findings, what it is that the 2-to-1 supports, and the observations of the staff, it was really making sure that the 2-to-1 clinical evidence was a combination of the multidisciplinary allied health, what was happening at school. Were they implementing the same strategies? Was there 2-to-1 support being provided at school, or was it a shared ratio amongst the specialist team? But the requirement for the 2-to-1 support for Josh, it was supported by incident data, risk assessments, BSP recommendations, functional behaviour assessment findings, and staff observations that were very clearly detailed and linked in to all the training that they had done that was specific for the participant, but also what it was that they did to work together. So not shifts working in silo, being able to demonstrate that the shift in the morning has had a really good handover from the overnight inactive shift. Was he up 7 times during the night? Did he abscond 3 times into the morning shift? They don't know what they're dealing with for the first half of the day, and what those triggers might be. He might be tired. Is that a trigger? Yes. Do we want to push him? No. Is there a way to try to manage the supports and the services that are available and the decisions that are being made in consultation with Josh, that are going to have a better outcome for him when he's in a better space to be able to respond to that? So when you're having the demonstration of the evidence to the NDIA, the 2-to-1, we really had to make sure that we were clearly understanding that it could not be managed by one single staff member, and for then Josh to have reasonable participation in ordinary life tasks and skills, whether it be within the home, school, or within the community, that the 2 staff are required to implement those proactive strategies, most importantly, and maintaining the environmental safety, the support for the daily living tasks, and to ensure the safe community access. So be able to just in closing for that, the level of support that's necessary to reduce risk, uphold his well-being, and provide the least restrictive and safest environment for him and those around him. That's going to be the sort of the holistic high-level approach that needs to be taken to that evidence base, but also the clinical application of his day-to-day supports. So that's the case study that I had. I'm sure that there's lots of questions that we probably have coming through as well in general, and if not in regards to the cases that are being presented or the information that's been presented today. So Steph, I might just hand over to you for any of the Q&As that come through.
Thanks, Tam. We do have a question. When the NDIS requests daily 2-to-1 evidence, including daily reports and minute-by-minute data, should this be submitted in advance as it is generated, or at regular intervals? And if so, how?
I can probably speak to that too. I can see, David, you just take yourself off mute, so I'll be quick. Look, from my experience, I would have regular care team meetings with their house leads or the lead support worker, if I had one, within the homes. And then for the 2-to-1, it would be every day, every shift, but then every week to fortnight, it would be a collation of the data. I would then write in a report as a progress report. I would then feed that into the support coordinator, and then there would be consultation every month minimum to be able to track what the capacity building was, what's being used in the 2-to-1, what's working well, what's not, what needs to be revised. So yes, daily collection, but regular reporting and structure around the sharing of the information with the clinical advisors as well. David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tam. Just adding to that, I've had a recent experience with a complex planner state that they are looking for that data as raw data. They're no longer expecting us to submit it to or to be collated by an allied health specialist, usually the BSP provider, to collate into a report, but to send them through as they come in. So if the data's been captured, when it gets sent through to the support coordinator, to send it straight into the inquiries line and have it online. You can still, as Tam was explaining, it's still important at the end of it to have it all represented in the reports and analysed. But the agency is looking for the raw data as well. So I've been, when the incident reports come in or the daily information capture comes in, just sending it straight through to the inquiries line.
Great. Thank you very much, David and Tam. As this is our first webinar, your input is, as in our audience, your input will help shape future sessions and ensure that we're covering topics that are most valuable to the sector. And we're also excited to share that our next webinar will focus on positive behaviour support. It will include a practical guide to what PBS is, how to access PBS in a plan, and the role of the practitioner. We'll be sharing further details soon, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and for your engagement throughout the session. And a special thank you to David and Tam for sharing their knowledge and experience, and to Steph for supporting the webinar behind the scenes. We hope you found today's discussion valuable and have come away with some practical insights that you can apply in your work. Thank you again for your time and support. Have a wonderful day, everyone.